Hold it up, Silas. Above the water, hold it up. My boy was chest deep in the Bay of Fundy and he was not screaming. That's the part that got me worse than the cold, the silence where a 12-year-old scream should have been, his arms locked around a yellow Kodak waterproof, holding it above the chop the way another child might hold a lantern, while the sandbar vanished inch by inch beneath his feet. I couldn't feel my hands. That was the first thing. Before the fear even caught up, I went to grab the gunnel of the skiff and my fingers wouldn't close right, half numb already though I wasn't even in the water yet, just soaked through from the spray. 22 years hauling gear off wrecks in this bay and I had never once taken it out that fast, never once redlined an engine older than my marriage, and somewhere behind me I could hear it screaming in a register it was never built for. The sandbar was a smear. Not a shape. A smear, gray on gray, and every few seconds another foot of it disappeared under the chop like the bay was folding a blanket over it. I know this water. I know exactly how to read the time it has left, because I've spent half my life reading this tide the way other men read a clock, and what I was reading right then was a number I didn't want to say out loud even inside my own skull. I went over the side. 6 hours earlier I was standing on the deck of the Cassandra Rose with a mug of Tim Hortons so strong it could strip paint, watching a rope of gulls tighten and loosen over a herring boat coming in past Cape Split, and everything was ordinary. That's the part people never believe when I tell it after, how ordinary the morning was. My hands were doing what they always do, dry and cracked at the knuckles from 30 years of salt water and rubber gloves, smelling faintly of neoprene the way they smell every day of my life whether I've been in a suit or not, because some things soak into a man and don't come back out. I had my thermos, the good one with the dent in the side from when it rolled off the Ingonish job 3 summers back. And without noticing I was doing it, my index finger was tapping against the rail, too quick, one slow, too quick, one slow, the rhythm of this bay's tide table, a habit my late father used to tease me about and that I picked up from him without ever deciding to. The phone rang. Odette. Dad and Red are taking Silas out on the boat, she said, and I heard the carefulness in her voice, the practiced brightness she puts on whenever she's steering me toward agreeing to something before I've had the chance to disagree. Just for the morning. Dad thinks it'll do him good. You know. Get him off the, she didn't finish it, but I finished it for her in my head, off the camera, off the notebooks, off whatever it is that makes Silas Silas instead of the boy Quimby man would have preferred. I didn't like it. I want to be honest about that, here at the start, because everything after makes more sense if you know I didn't like it from the first word. Not because Quade Quimby is a bad grandfather in any way a court could prove. He's never raised a hand to that boy. He's never even raised his voice, not really, he doesn't need to, when a man owns 4 cargo terminals and half the harbor masters between here and Halifax, he's found other ways to make people feel small. And the way he makes Silas feel small is with a kind of gentleness that has teeth in it. Last Thanksgiving, over the good china Odette only brings out twice a year, Quade set his fork down and said, not unkindly, not even looking at Silas, that camera is the only thing keeping that boy from coming out of his shell, Aldous. Somebody ought to lose it for him. I remember exactly how my back teeth felt when he said that. I let it go. I always let it go, because Odette asks me to with her eyes before she can ask me with her mouth, please, not today, let them have this, and because some tired, worn-down part of me still believes that a man who married into money he'll never touch doesn't get to make waves at his own in-laws' table. Rhett, her brother, the golden boy, the one who inherited the smile and the signature and apparently none of whatever conscience skips a generation in that family, Rhett just smirked into his wine and said something about toughening the kid up, teach him to be a man instead of a, and he didn't finish that one either. He didn't have to. I've heard the unfinished half of that sentence in 100 different rooms my whole married life. So when Odette called that morning to say her father and her brother were taking my son out on the Quimby Voyager for a few hours of sea air, I said the thing a man says when he's tired of being the only one in the room who thinks his son doesn't need fixing. I said fine. I regretted it by noon. The second call didn't come from Odette. It came from a number I didn't have saved, and when I picked it up, it took me a second to place the voice at all, because I have never once in 9 years of marriage heard Quade Quimby sound like that. Not at the wedding when he gave that speech that was really about himself. Not the time a container ship nearly took out his private dock and he stood there dictating insurance figures to his lawyer before the swells had even settled. I have heard that man cold, smug, condescending, amused. I have never heard him sound like he was drowning in his own throat. Aldous, the boy, he went off toward the flats. We didn't. The tide's coming in faster than the board said. You need to. I didn't let him finish. I was already moving, the phone still pressed to my ear, my boots half-laced, my mind snagging on one detail I couldn't shake even as I ran. Quade Quimby does not stammer. Quade Quimby has never in his life failed to finish a sentence when money or blame was involved. And yet there he was, this rich, polished, unbothered man, sounding like something had gotten its hands around his throat that had nothing at all to do with a 12-year-old boy on a sandbar. I asked him where. He told me. I asked him why in God's name they hadn't called the Coast Guard first, called anyone official, and there was a half-second of silence on that line that I would turn over and over in my head for days afterward, a silence with something buried in it I couldn't yet name. Then I was in the skiff, and then I was in the water, and then I was screaming a boy's name into a dead radio because some part of me needed to be screaming it into something. The gulls that had been circling the herring boat that morning were gone. In their place, out over the flats, a single dark shape wheeled once and dropped low toward the sandbar, toward my son, and toward a small, battered, unmistakably yellow shape clutched against his chest that I would not understand the weight of, not really, not for 3 more days. By the time I reached him the water was up past his ribs and climbing, and he was not screaming the way I'd braced myself for. That's the thing about my boy that people who don't know him get wrong every single time. Silas doesn't come apart the way the rest of us do. He goes still. He goes so still it frightens people worse than screaming would, because stillness in a crisis reads as something broken instead of something holding itself together the only way it knows how. His lips had gone the color of the sky. His teeth were chattering hard enough that I could hear them over the water. And both his arms were locked around that camera like it was the only solid thing left in the whole drowning world, held up out of the spray even as the rest of him shook. Silas. Silas, look at me. We're going to swim now, bud, okay? I've got you. He didn't look at me. He looked at the camera. He said something, low, fast, the same 3 or 4 syllables over and over, and I couldn't make sense of it over the wind and the water in my own ears, and for one animal second I thought about prying his fingers loose, thought about how much faster I could get him to shore with both his arms free to hold on to my neck instead of that stupid, ruined, waterlogged piece of yellow plastic that wasn't going to survive this any better than we might not. I didn't do it. I want to say I made some wise, fatherly decision in that half second, but the truth is simpler and less flattering. I looked at his face, at how far away his eyes had gone, and I understood that if I tore that thing out of his hands right now, in the middle of the worst 5 minutes of his life, I would be doing more damage than the tide ever could. So I got one arm around him, hooked the strap of the camera over my own wrist so it rode against both our chests, and I swam. I don't remember much of the swim back. I remember my legs cramping somewhere around the halfway point and not stopping. I remember Silas's chattering syllables slowing down, then stopping altogether, which frightened me far worse than the chattering had. I remember, with a strange clarity that only comes back to me in bad dreams now, looking out toward open water and realizing the white shape of the Quimby Voyager, Quade's boat, 72 feet of teak and brass that I had once joked cost more than every house on my street combined, was already a mile off, running for the marina at Digby, its wake a long pale scar on the gray water. Not idling. Not circling back. Running. Nobody had called the Coast Guard. I found that out later, from the duty officer at Digby who looked at me like I'd grown a second head when I asked what time they'd gotten the call. Nobody but me had come. Digby General isn't a big hospital, but it's got a warmth to it that the city places don't. The kind of small-town hospital where the nurse taking your son's temperature already knows your name because her husband bought a boat off you 2 summers back. Silas came in at 94.1, which the doctor said, with the flat calm doctors used to keep you from panicking, was serious but not the kind of serious that keeps a family up at night for weeks. They wrapped him in warming blankets, put a line in his arm, and within an hour his color was starting to come back, though he wouldn't let go of the camera even then, not even to let the nurse dry his hands properly. She was good about it. She let him hold it under the blanket instead. Odette got there 20 minutes after I did, her coat still half-buttoned, her hair coming loose from its clip, and I watched something in her face break open when she saw Silas sitting up, blinking, alive. She went to him first, of course she went to him first, and I wouldn't have wanted it any other way, and it was a full 2 minutes before she turned to me, and when she did, her eyes were red-rimmed but her voice had already started climbing towards something sharper. Where were they, Aldous? Where were my father and Rhett when you got there? Gone, I said. Already halfway to Digby by the time I had him out of the water. That can't, Dad called you. Dad said he called the second they realized Silas had wandered off toward the flats. He called me, all right. Didn't call the Coast Guard. Didn't call 911. Called me, on a number I don't even think he's dialed in 3 years, and by the time I looked up from putting the boat in the water, their yacht was already turning for home. She went quiet at that, the kind of quiet I recognized, because I'd watched her go quiet in exactly that way at exactly 2 other moments in 9 years of marriage, both times when something her father had done didn't add up, and some part of her that loved him too much to look straight at it was already building the excuse before I could finish the accusation. He panicked, she said. You know how he is with situations. He's not good in a crisis, he never has been, he probably just, Odette. He's run a shipping company through 2 hurricanes and a longshoreman's strike without breaking a sweat. Don't tell me Quade Quimby doesn't know how to act in a crisis. She didn't have an answer for that. She looked instead toward the bed, toward Silas, who had drifted into the kind of thin, exhausted sleep that comes after a body's been that cold, his fingers still curled loosely around the strap of the camera even in sleep, and something in her face folded the argument away for later, the way she always did, the way I'd let her do for 9 years because I loved her more than I was willing to fight her family. I went to try Quade myself. Straight to voicemail. Tried Rhett, same. I stood in that hallway with the smell of hospital disinfectant thick in my nose and dialed both those numbers 4 times each over the course of an hour, and neither one of those men who had been so eager to rush their nephew out onto open water that morning could be bothered to pick up a phone and ask if he'd made it. It was near midnight, Silas finally properly asleep, color back in his cheeks, when Odette came and sat next to me in the hard plastic chairs outside his room, and for a while neither of us said anything. I had the camera in my lap. I'd taken it off Silas's wrist once he was under, the nurse's suggestion, so it wouldn't dig into his skin while he slept, and I was turning it over, looking at the crack running through the housing, the sand still packed into the seams around the lens. I should get that cleaned up before the salt sets in properly, I said, mostly to myself. Sand and salt water together, it'll seize the whole mechanism inside a day if I don't. Give it to me, Odette said. I'll take it home tonight. Dad said, and she stopped herself, but not soon enough, because I'd already caught it, and my whole body had gone still in a way that had nothing to do with the cold anymore. Dad said what? She looked at the floor. He called while you were trying to reach him. Left a message on my phone, not yours. Said he wanted to have someone look at the camera, get it properly repaired before it's too far gone. Said he felt terrible, said it's the least he could do. I sat there with that battered yellow rectangle in my 2 cracked hands, and I thought about the fork going down on the good china at Thanksgiving, and I thought about somebody ought to lose it for him, and I thought about how in 9 years I had never once heard Quade Quimby volunteer to fix anything of Silas's that he hadn't first spent a year sneering at. He wants to fix the thing he told me to take away from our son, I said slowly, like I was working out a sum out loud. He feels guilty, Aldous. People do strange things out of guilt. Maybe. I turned it over once more in my hands. There was a soft click somewhere inside the housing that hadn't been there this morning, a rattle where there shouldn't be one. Or maybe a man who runs a boat that fast toward home instead of toward his own grandson isn't feeling guilty about the boy at all. Odette's jaw tightened, and for a second I thought she was going to walk away from me the way she sometimes did when I'd pushed too close to something about her family she wasn't ready to look at. Instead she just said, very quietly, "What are you saying?" I didn't answer her right away. I was looking at the little viewing window on the back of the camera, cracked clean across, the screen behind it dead and dark, and I was thinking about the way her father's voice had sounded on that phone that afternoon, not a father's fear. Something else. Something with an edge to it I couldn't yet name, and wouldn't let go of. "I'm saying I'd like to hold on to it a little longer," I said. "That's all. Just a little longer." She didn't fight me on it. Maybe some part of her didn't want to know the answer either. She kissed Silas's forehead through the crack in the door before we left that night, and I sat in the truck in the hospital parking lot with the camera on the seat beside me, one cracked corner of yellow plastic catching the sodium light of the lot lamp, and instead of driving home I found myself scrolling through my contacts to a name I hadn't called in over a year, not out of any falling out, just the ordinary distance that grows between two brothers who chose two very different lives, one of us elbow deep in wreck salvage off Digby Neck, the other one climbing through the ranks of federal marine investigations until people in 3 provinces knew better than to lie to him. Reese picked up on the second ring, the way he always did, like he never quite let himself relax enough to miss a call. "Aldous. It's late. Everything all right?" I looked down at the camera on the seat, at the sound still caught in its seams, at the small crack running clean across the lens like a fault line. "Reese," I said, "I need you to look at something before somebody makes it disappear." It took his people 4 days to pull anything usable off that card. My brother didn't tell me much over the phone in the meantime, old habit of his. 30 years in federal marine investigations will teach a man not to promise what he can't yet prove, but when he finally drove out to Digby Neck himself instead of just calling, I knew whatever was on that memory card wasn't a father-in-law's harmless afternoon on the water. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Silas does his drawing every evening with his placemat squared up exactly the way he likes it, and Reese laid out 4 printed photographs like a man dealing cards he didn't enjoy holding. The first 2 were exactly what I'd feared and somehow still wasn't ready for. Rhett, sleeves rolled, tipping drums over the rail into open water while Quaid stood behind him with his hand raised, not stopping him, directing him, the angle of it unmistakable even through a 12-year-old's shaky, sideways grip on the shutter. "Marine dumping," Reese said. "That water's inside a protected zone, Aldous. That alone is fines running into the millions, maybe a suspended operating license for the whole company. Enough to explain panic. Enough to explain wanting that card gone. But not enough to explain leaving him on a sandbar with the tide coming in," I said. "No." He slid the 3rd photograph across. "This is what wasn't enough." It was blurred, half accidental, the kind of shot a boy takes when he's not looking through the viewfinder at all, just holding the camera up toward whatever's nearest while something else has his attention. In this case, the boat's chart plotter screen, mounted just above the helm, its display caught bright and legible for 1 frozen quarter second. A saved waypoint. A set of coordinates with a name attached, the kind fishermen and salvage men give places nobody wants to remember out loud. Widow's Reach. I knew that name. Everybody who's worked this coast for more than a decade knows that name, the way you know a scar on somebody else's hand without asking how they got it. 15 years back, a bulk carrier called the Aurelia Dawn went down out past there in weather that, at the time, didn't seem bad enough to sink a ship that size. 4 men lost. Insurance paid out on a cargo manifest nobody outside the company ever got to verify. "That's the Aurelia Dawn's last known position," Reese said. "Except it isn't the position in the official report. It's about 6 nautical miles off from where the report says she went down. 6 miles is nothing to a storm. It's everything to a claims investigator who never had a reason to doubt the number he was handed." I sat with that a long moment, the 4th photograph still face down on the table, untouched, and something in my chest that had been braced for pure hatred these last 4 days found, instead, a strange and unwelcome clarity. "He built the company on that money," I said slowly. "The company, the terminals, this house you're sitting in by marriage," Reese said, not unkindly, just plain. 4 men died in a wreck he arranged for the payout, and he spent 15 years being the man everyone in this province tips their hat to. He wasn't scared of a dumping fine, Aldous. He was scared of a photograph a boy took by accident of a screen he probably forgot was even switched on. I thought of Quaid's voice on the phone that day, the stammer, the thing I couldn't name at the time. I could name it now. It wasn't a grandfather's fear for a drowning child. It was a man watching 15 years of careful lying come untethered because a 12-year-old with a broken camera happened to be standing in the wrong place at exactly the right moment. Reese handled the rest the way Reese handles everything, quietly, thoroughly, without theater. There was no dramatic arrest at the terminal gates, no reporters, nothing Quaid could spin into martyrdom at a shareholders' meeting. Just a plain government sedan in the driveway of the Quimby house one Tuesday morning, and a request, worded the way federal men word these things, that Quaid and Rhett present themselves at the Marine Investigations Office in Halifax to discuss some questions arising from a recent maritime incident. I went. Odette asked me to, and some part of me needed to see it with my own eyes besides. Quaid sat across that table in a suit that cost more than my truck, and for the first 30 seconds he was still Quaid, chin up, voice smooth, already framing the dumping charge as an unfortunate operational oversight his legal team would clear up by Friday. Rhett, beside him, had the loose, unbothered posture of a man who'd never once in his life expected a consequence to actually land on him. Then Reese set the photograph of the chart plotter screen on the table between them, said the words Widow's Reach and Aurelia Dawn in the same flat sentence, and I watched something happen to Quaid Quimby's face that I will remember for the rest of my life, not rage, not denial, but a kind of collapse from the inside, the muscles simply forgetting, for a moment, how to hold up the expression he'd worn for 15 years. He didn't confess, not there, not in words. Men like Quaid rarely do. But he stopped talking about legal teams. He asked, very quietly, whether Reese had told anyone else yet, and Reese said only that the file was open now, and open files don't stay small, and that was the whole of it. No shouting. No triumph from my side of the table either. I'd expected to want that. Some part of me had spent 4 days rehearsing exactly what I'd say to that man, and when the moment came I found I didn't want to say any of it. I just wanted him to understand, without me raising my voice, that the tide he'd tried to use against a 12-year-old boy had come around on him instead, the way tides in this bay always eventually do to the people foolish enough to think they can outrun them. Rhett tried, once, to make it about me, some line about how a man who married up ought to know when to mind his own business, and Reese, without even looking up from his notes, said that obstruction of a federal marine inquiry tended to go worse for people who couldn't help running their mouths. Rhett didn't say anything else after that. Odette didn't speak to her father for the better part of 2 months. Some nights she cried at the kitchen table after Silas was asleep, not for the man Quaid turned out to be, but for the one she'd spent 34 years believing he was. I didn't try to talk her through it. I just made the tea and sat across from her and let her have it, whatever shape it needed to take that night. Silas didn't understand most of what had happened, not in the way adults understand consequence and inquiry and insurance fraud, and I was glad of that. What he understood was simpler and, in its way, more important, that his camera had been taken from him by someone who was frightened of what it saw, and that it wasn't coming back the same. The old Kodak never worked again. Salt water, sand, the crack across the housing, the tech at the shop in Yarmouth managed to save the memory card, but the camera itself was finished, its little yellow body permanently seized around a shutter that would never click again. I didn't tell Silas that right away. I ordered a replacement first, the closest match I could find through an old marine supply contact who still had a line to the manufacturer, the same shade of yellow, the same waterproof housing, a few features better than the old one but close enough that when I set it down on the kitchen table in front of him, his hands went to it the same way they'd gone to the old one on the sandbar, immediate and certain, like greeting something he'd been missing without knowing its name. New one, I told him. Same as your old one. Better seal on the lens door this time, so salt water can't get in so easy. He turned it over twice, checked the strap, checked the little door over the battery compartment the way he always does before he trusts a thing, and then he lifted it and took a photograph of me sitting there at the table, the way he does most evenings now, cataloging the ordinary the way other people write diaries. The old one sits in an evidence bag now, in a federal file somewhere in Halifax, its casing still bearing the crack it earned that day on the flats, sand still packed somewhere down in its seams that nobody will ever bother to clean out, because it isn't a keepsake anymore. It's an exhibit. Somewhere in that same building, a 15-year-old case that everyone had long since stopped asking questions about has a new folder sitting on top of the old one. And here, on my own kitchen table, a boy who nearly drowned for something a rich man was ashamed of takes his 611th photograph of the year, unbothered, humming to himself, already looking past me toward the window where the tide outside is coming in exactly the way it always does, indifferent to men like Quade Quimby, and entirely on my son's side. Some evenings now, when the light's gone that particular grey gold it gets over the flats in October, I catch myself standing at the sink a little too long, watching Silas at the table behind me through the window's reflection, camera up, framing something only he finds worth keeping, the steam off his tea, the crooked way the salt shaker sits, my own hands at the tap. He doesn't ask why any of it matters. He never has. That was always the thing Quade couldn't forgive him for, I think, not the camera itself, but the fact that Silas never once needed permission to love what he loved. He just did it, plainly, and kept doing it, and no amount of good china or quiet condescension ever put a dent in that. I still have the old thermos, the dented one. It rides in the truck same as always, and some mornings, out on the water, my finger still finds that same tide table rhythm against the wheel without my telling it to, too quick, one slow, an old habit that outlived the reason I ever needed it. I don't tap it out thinking of Quade anymore, or of that gray afternoon on the flats, or even of Reese's flat voice reading coordinates off a chart plotter screen. Mostly I don't think of anything at all when I do it. It's just a hand remembering a rhythm, the way hands do. Odette speaks to her father again now, carefully, the way you'd handle something you know is cracked clean through even if it looks whole from the outside. He sends birthday cards. He hasn't once mentioned the camera since, not the old one gone quiet in its evidence bag in Halifax, not the new one that never leaves Silas's hands longer than it takes to charge. The cards come with his handwriting on them, neat and careful, and Silas lines them up on his shelf without opening them, which might be the most honest review of Quade Quimby anyone's ever given. Most evenings, though, it's just the two of us at the table, Silas framing whatever catches his eye, me pretending not to notice when the lens swings my way. That's enough. That's the whole of it. The shutter clicks once more behind me. I don't turn around. I let him have the shot.